Let's start with you, Douglas, because ideology is a good place to begin, and the mere question of whether British Conservatives should have a coherent ideology is something that Conservatives argue about.
Absolutely. Conservatism itself, you could argue, is an anti-ideological ideology. It doesn't want to engage in the doctrines that the left, for instance, engages in. However, I would argue that the right, Conservatives, have to have a defined ideology, not least in recent decades, because the onslaught from the left has been so intense and so far-reaching in its consequences that you cannot rebut it solely by non-ideology alone.
And that means that if you are somebody like David Cameron at the helm, you need kind of strong underpinnings to ensure that you're not just buffeted by events.
I think you'd need to know where you're coming from.
And so, in its essence, neoconservatism for a British audience means what?
Well, neoconservatism is simply a brand of conservatism, but which is propelled by the desire to conserve, and in neoconservatism's case would also believe in certain situations, such as foreign affairs, being rather more proactive, perhaps, than traditional small c conservatism.
Peter Hitchens, you would regard yourself, you called yourself in the past a paleo-conservative rather than a neo-conservative.
Well,
paleo meaning old, but I mean...
people call me that. It's not. It's just a term to try and distinguish myself, apart from anything else, from Douglas and his mad foreign adventures that he's so strangely keen on. But it is...
And I would prefer a way to live which is perhaps less financially remunerative.
Douglas Murray.
And one of the things that used to be said by some conservatives here and in America after the Cold War was that the right had won the economic conflict and that the left had won the culture wars. And actually this boast, half boast as it were, has come back to bite those conservatives who argued it, because there's no doubt that I think wrongly, the right has been saddled with the mistakes that have gone on in recent years, have been to a large extent blamed for excesses within the market that we have seen in both in America and in the UK. And I think that's a serious problem that conservatism is going to have to get over, and it's going to have to be a culture war, as it were, that it's going to have to fight itself. I just wanted to put in one other pillar of conservatism which is worth discussing, which is the issue of institutions. The idea that the market is the institution, that the market will do, that's enough, is of course a terrible mistake. Societies, and conservative societies, are made up partly by their reliance on a whole range of institutions. The rule of law, the law courts, the monarchy in the case of Britain, a parliament, a working parliament that actually does the job that parliament is meant to do. All of these things which, if you actually look at Britain in particular today, you can't help but come to the conclusion that at the very least all of these institutions have been significantly debased, and at the root of that is, I think, the reason why some people end up relying on the idea that only one institution, the market, can take us out of this malaise.
Is there a
institutions and traditions has almost completely been wiped out, and both the main political parties have also been taken over by neoliberalism in internal putches. So there's almost no room, particularly in the Conservative Party, for any genuine conservative discourse.
If I can say, the reason why we're at such a juncture, in my opinion, is why this matters, is because, among other things, there is a risk at the moment that people will rely on the idea that the only thing that has got us where we are is, for instance, Fred Goodwin. The only thing that has got us where we are a few bankers and so on. And whilst the catastrophe within the banking sector is undoubtedly a factor, we will not get through this period if we do not also recognise the fact that government, without the banking bailout, has been so vastly overspending that it is unsustainable anyway. If you are borrowing, as we have already this fiscal year, more than 100 billion without anything to do with the banking bailout, that should be a warning something is going wrong in your spending.
But the origin of that, this is so important, I have to push in here, the origin of that is not just a decision to spend lots more money. The origin of it was the decision in the 1960s that the state should become the parent,
yes,
that more and more people should be married to the state, that the family should become less and less important. And the reason why we have such a huge number of people dependent upon the welfare state is this deliberate decision to create, and now to continue to creating endlessly, fatherless families which the state is responsible responsible for. That's the reason why the entire product of the income tax is now spent on welfare.
Can I just bring in Douglas Murray, because in your vision of neoconservatism, you would like to slash the state right back. You'd like to cut taxes back much more radically to create a more individualistic and less state-dependent society. Are you looking at what the Conservative government is doing now? Are you just purely a voice out there in the wilderness, or do you have connections with the Conservative family which actually starts to put some of your ideas into practice?
I wouldn't want to harm the career of anyone by naming names in the Conservative Party of anyone who sympathises with what I think, but I think that I think to an extent all Conservative voices, the small c, neocon, paleocon, whatever, are to an extent in the wilderness at the moment, because we have found ourselves in a slightly similar situation to that which the States has been in for some years, which is to say that the battles have become phony battles. In the States, the argument about abortion, Roe versus Wade, come all the time. In fact, Republican or Democrat, extremely unlikely that the abortion laws are going to change in the US. These things are fought incredibly hard, but they're actually diversionary conflicts. And in the meantime, all sorts of other things go through without anyone batting an eyelid. Again, the example of the war on single mothers. The phantom culture wars fought, whilst the real things go through unnoticed. And I think there's one, if I can say so, very good battle going on at the moment that's a real battle, and that's the one that the coalition government is involved in over whether or not you should be paid better if you work than if you don't work. And the extraordinary conflict, apart from anything else, in the House of Lords that has come across...
We should remind people, this is the £26,000
Yes.
cap, which is the maximum that a family on benefits can receive, because
Yes.
it is the average wage.
And this is already being talked about
Proposal.
in entirely sentimental terms. Here is a family with 5 children who've got 30,000 a year on benefits, and therefore they will not be able to live the life they would like. The BBC did something on such a family the other day. And this diverts from the real issue, which is the terrible disincentive and the terrible disaster across society that occurs when you do not incentivize people to work, to get out there, to find, apart from anything else, nobility in providing for their dependents.
What would your welfare state look like?
It would be a safety net. It would be what the welfare state was always meant to be, or should have been, in my opinion, which is that it was a safety net that caught those in need, but that didn't become a smothering safety blanket that ended up in sending us into the situation we're currently in, where you have generation after generation of families who have not only never known work, but have never known that they ought to know work.
The trouble with the wind farm issue is that it is seen as too much, too quick, and how a big question over its efficacy. Should we not be looking more at offshore wind? Should we not be looking more at marine energy and also conservation? And of course the protection of the countryside.
Of course, for a lot of Conservatives, they've been late into this debate, I think for a very clear reason, which is that the green issue, the green agenda, as it were, was seen rightly by many of them to have been hijacked by so-called watermelons, people who were green on the outside but very red on the inside. And to an extent, this scared a lot of Conservatives off dealing with that issue. But
wrongly.
Wrongly. But plus the fact that many watermelons were sort of attacking conservative institutions and conservative ideas, and a lot of Conservatives thought, well, in that case we must defend, the oil companies, or we must defend, and came up with it. Actually, they ended up on very weak terrain. I think that the Conservative policy here can be defined, apart from anything else, in opposition to what one might call Prescottism, which is the idea that in order to satisfy our future energy needs, we must build over the last remaining bits of Britain that are worth looking at, and say that we need in perpetuity so much energy that we'll no longer have any green land that we'd want to look at. I think that the Scrutonian vision of this, that actually green conservatism comes from the local community, it comes from individuals, it doesn't rely on big government for the solutions, it relies on itself, is a very worthwhile one.